I shared a little bit about my trip to Albuquerque, New Mexico for Cross Examine Instructors Academy, and just around so many um, warriors in the faith and their desire to be warriors in this world, committing violence against evil for the sake of those who are deceived by evil, through apologetics, through their expertise, through the field of ministry that they're in. And a part of that was being able to give a presentation on any given topic and then stand up to scrutiny, with the hopes that you would take these skills and take it wherever you want in the world. But you need to know that you need to present a cause for why the gospel is true, maybe theologically or practically, but then also you needed to stand up to the inevitable scrutiny that's going to come as a result of that. And I just heard some phenomenal arguments from people who are on the ground with certain things. We've discussed transgenderism on this podcast. We've discussed it conceptually, theologically. We've discussed it. But when it comes down to like the stuff, the people who are studying it, writing the books about it, and the science behind it.
Yeah.
I mean, that word.
I know. What an abused word.
Science.
Yeah. It means nothing at this point. I don't know what it means.
Yeah, at this point, it means nothing. Once upon a time, it came from scientia, meaning to know.
Yeah.
Now it's just like, a draw four. It's like, hey, I believe I'm a donkey. Well, look, you're not a donkey, but the science. Conversation over now.
Donkey, you are.
Yeah. And then you say whatever you want after that. It's wild. But hopefully, that's the most of what you'll hear me talk about on this episode regarding it, because we've got a faithful sister in the Lord with us, a growing friend that I met while in Albuquerque, and she's joining us today on Black and Blurred, Dr. Brittany LaBuff.
Yeah.
Britt,
hi.
What's up? Welcome on Black and Blurred.
Thanks. It's good to be here.
Absolutely. Now you're in PA, right? You said you're in PA.
Yes. Yeah.
We're in PA.
Central PA. Yeah, near Penn State.
Now, I asked you this when we were in New Mexico, but what's the climate there? Not as in weather-wise, but like politically, spiritually.
Yeah. So the town, I would say it's pretty conservative. The university, getting closer to the university, obviously is more liberal, but I would say they're culturally conservative, not necessarily Christian conservative.
Ooh.
So just something that I observed. I grew up in this town. Me and my husband moved back a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm. We met while living up in Massachusetts. So we've been back here for about 2 years. And
fresh.
Yeah. So I would say that's how I would describe it.
We were just talking about the cultural. I mean, we've talked about it multiple times, the cultural conservatism versus conservatism as a fruit of your faith.
Yes.
Like, you could throw marriage in the conservative box, but I value marriage because God made marriage. So
right. Right. And I don't even know if I shared this with you, but I'd walked away from my faith for a number of years, and most definitely identified as a liberal. I voted left. I was very, very much until I came back to church, and becoming conservative was a result of the Holy Spirit changing my heart and my mind towards these issues of politics. It was not the other way around for me.
Yeah.
I was very quickly convicted of a lot of the views that I held, and it was just so clear to me that I couldn't be a faithful Christian while still supporting politics that were oppositional to God's word. So
now we talked about, was that last episode when I showed you that social media clip with the lesbian shooting guns?
That was last episode.
We got a faithful listener in here with us. There was this clip that I saw. Are you familiar with this guy, Dom Lucre or whatever? DOMLUCRE?
No.
Yeah, I mean, it's a conservative page. I've seen it on Twitter. I've seen it on Instagram. And there was a post he made about these two girls, they're lesbians, in this sexually compromising position while one is shooting like a 50 cal or something like that. And all the conservatives on there were basically like, yeah, you know, hell yeah, we don't care about that. Love is love. If people only knew that we actually don't care about that stuff, just stay away from the kids, stay away from the kids, stay away from
Mm.
and I was making this point of like, why stay away from the kids? Because you think it's nasty or you find it inconvenient? Because if there's a God who sets the standard by which we say stay away from the kids, then he also sets the standards by which we say sex belongs in the confines of marriage between man and a woman.
Right.
Right. So and so just building on this kind of moral bankruptcy behind secular conservatism, and I think that's showing itself more and more. But so let's share with our listeners what you do.
Yeah, so I have my PhD in exercise physiology. I work full time as a scientist for a fitness company. And I have a passion for apologetics. So I'm a Christian scientist, which I think gives me a little bit different perspective than a lot of the people that I work with. And certainly the training that I got was not through a Christian lens academically. So now I kind of try to bridge my skills as a scientist and my passion for apologetics to tackle issues that I struggled with myself and that culture at large is struggling with, that I just am interested in being able to speak to. And because of my interest in exercise physiology, one of those areas has been, transgender ideology and how that is impacting culture, but also just sports and women. I'm a mom of two small kids. And so that this kind of fills all of those interests and gaps for me. So this issue of transgender ideology is something that I've just taken an interest in. And that's what I presented at Cross-Examined Instructor Academy.
Yeah. I was impressed by your presentation. Exercise physiology. How did you get into that?
Well, I took an exercise physiology class when I was an undergraduate. I wasn't planning on going to school for that. I was studying an undergrad to be a physician assistant. Thought I was going to go more clinical route. And I started doing research in our exercise physiology lab at the college I was at and just became really interested in it, wanted to get more training and research. So I went on to do a master's degree and then decided that I wanted to be a professional academic. I had goals of being a professor one day and doing research full time. And so I went on from that point to get my PhD. So I was in school for about 10 years and then did a postdoc in, it was exercise physiology, but also sociology, looking at physical activity and how those behaviors translate in middle schoolers and how the social contagion of physical activity.
Wow.
Yeah.
Was this, is that amidst the transgender craze thing? Is that related, or that was just the point?
No, at the time I wasn't even faithfully following the Lord, actually, all through my PhD, like from the time I left for college until just a few years ago. I walked away from my faith, and slowly, but then eventually was just like completely not interested in anything to do with God. And so at the time, no, but now looking back, there definitely were certain things that happened in some of like the research that I was doing in the area that I was in, that inform how I'm able to look at this topic in particular, but also kind of sift through the propaganda about it and look at it more objectively with a scientific lens, if you will, even though it's a very emotionally charged topic.
Yeah. I was just doing a teaching with middle and high schoolers, and we talked a lot about sex. It was kind of the focal point was guard your heart as they go back to school. how to guard your heart. What does that look like? We talked about identity, we talked about sex, and then we also talked more specifically about race, just from a theological kind of lens. And the beauty of how God loves unity, but he loves diversity. The unity is presented in non-sameness, and the fact that even man and woman are alike but different, and I love the fact that he has called so many of his people away from different nations and different kingdoms, and all these nations and these kingdoms have all these different deities ascribed to them, and you have people who look like people who worship those kingdoms, but they don't. They worship the one true and living God, and they're from a vast array. And we've been made to be a holy nation ourselves. And all that to say, some of those kingdoms are even these ideologies like transgenderism, like sexuality, like homosexuality, sexual licentiousness, drugs, alcohol. And I love how the Lord, even politics, I love how the Lord calls people from those kingdoms so they can look like the people who still are in those kingdoms, but they're representatives of the Lord, and they know how to talk. They know where the cracks and crevices are, how to maneuver in this kingdom. That's just kind of the picture I got when you were talking about how you went through your entire PhD as someone with eyes that wasn't even seen as one in the kingdom. But now that you are in the kingdom, you still know all the different codes and that you're about to share with us a little bit. So I guess the start point, my start point would be you have a passion for apologetics as a exercise physicist,
scientist,
exercise. Yeah. How do those merge? How do you find yourself presenting apologetics in that type of context?
Yeah, well, not in any sort of traditional sense. I think it's what a lot of people experience. It's having one-off conversations about something where there's an opportunity to plant a seed of just disagreement, or an opportunity to maybe share a little bit more. I work remotely, so those conversations don't happen as frequently maybe as if I were seeing people all the time in person. But in the field of exercise science, just think about all of the debates right now that are going on with things like women's sports and those sorts of issues, having transgender athletes compete in women's categories, and if that's fair, if it makes sense physiologically, all those sorts of things. Those are conversations that are not just for professional sports. They're seeping into all areas of anything exercise related, fitness, sports, all of that. And so it does impact the work that I do and the way that I think about, interacting with people who maybe are transgender, but also my job as a scientist is to be objective as possible and present things without I'm not trying to be emotional about the decisions. I need to be logical and rational when making decisions about physiology. And so this issue in particular, I would say, is a cultural issue that actually impacts that. It's more than just, DEI type of things. It's actually how we are testing for things, how we're making categories for people and we're allowing them to compete against. And so those aren't things that I take lightly. Yeah. And I have felt like it's a very touchy topic and a lot of people don't want to talk about it. And you see why, right? In the media, you see people who voice opinions that are oppositional to this just get absolutely dragged. For whatever reason, this one issue is just like,
I want to, or even just raise, questions.
Right.
Yeah.
A question you just asked, like, is this logical? Does this make sense?
Mm-hmm.
I want to know more about how that plays out in the scientific world specifically. But before I get into that, when you mentioned these, obviously you're dealing with physical sciences. There are physiological differences between men and women. But there are physiological differences even amongst men. Like you think about in sports, something like wrestling, they have weight classes. Like, I mean, when I don't even know how to ask this question, but does the transgender murkiness even begin to affect the way we think about those types of things too? Like, are there smaller guys saying, "I want to wrestle with the 250s. I want to"? That's not fair. I mean,
Well, well, the ideology in a sense, yes. I mean, take the ideology to like the end point. If you can say that you identify as anything, where is the limit with that?
yeah,
Is it just gender or sexual attraction or what, or can it be anything? Can it truly be anything? And you've heard people talk about transableism, where they feel like they should be disabled or feel like they should be a different race, or these really what most people would be considered to be bizarre. You think that's bizarre, but you don't think it's bizarre that a man wants to identify as a little girl. Like that logically does not make any sense, because it's saying the same thing, that you can identify as something that you are not, and people are to accept it because you say that it's true.
Now,
So
scientific method.
so here's the thing. The scientific community is very this is a hot button issue, because the field of science that I'm in is more it's not a social science. So the social sciences are what kind of initially started this movement, like way back when. It was psychologists and John Money, Alfred Kinsey, these people who were studying sexuality. That was their research, was actually on those things. And so people in my world, I would say, aren't really aware of that. I wasn't aware of that because I didn't take gender studies or anything like that. I had no idea about the history of any of those, awful studies that were performed on like little kids, and
Right. Yeah.
just absolutely awful work. And if anyone is curious, like just Google John Money or Alfred Kinsey, and it will come up some of the research that they did. Yeah. So there's that area of research, and that's back in the 50s. That was a long time ago. But now we're seeing a request for research that is representative of transgender individuals. Now, the problem with that is, well, there are a lot of problems, but one main problem is that there isn't a lot of research on it because it's such a small percentage of the population. And for all of time until very recently, there wasn't this surge of transgender women, so men who identify as women, playing in women's sports or competing or having, a lot of physical studies done on them to study their exercise habit. Like, it's just something that doesn't exist right now. There's not a strong body of evidence. And what happens when there's not a strong body of evidence is people kind of just take whatever they want to use as evidence until we get more science to say something should or shouldn't happen. And that's why it's become such a hyper emotional argument rather than a rational and logical one, because there is not a huge body of literature to point to say, look, these studies show that transgender women are the same as women, and there's no difference in their hormones. There's no difference in their performance outcomes. We don't have that right now. Yeah. And I worry actually that even if we do have that because of the way scientific articles are being kind of flagged down on this issue, that we may not have sound science. So there have been scientists who have tried to publish some of these pieces, not even necessarily physiology pieces, but just talking about detransitioners, so people who have transitioned to the opposite gender and transitioned back. And any issues around that weren't really favorable to the narrative that's being played out, they were, dragged through the mud and canceled, so to speak. And people with very good reputations, they have, several years of service, never had any sort of dishonest science or anything like that. But because they talked about this issue in a way that wasn't inclusive enough, their entire scientific reputation now is being questioned. And that's pretty much what happens to people who decide to speak out on this, and their findings, aren't in line with the narrative that's at play.
Why do you think Christians don't? I think Christians are aware that that type of stuff happens. They might not be aware of the ins and outs behind it, but Christians are definitely aware that there are other Christians who will have a thought, and that thought gets shut down. Let's use that general phrase. It either gets shut down by them losing their job or losing an account or being threatened or whatever, but it gets shut down. How come Christians don't see that as kind of trying to perpetuate these narratives by force? Like if transgenderism, for example, is true, why do you have to use force of removing people
Right.
from positions and things? Why doesn't it just speak for itself? Why do you think Christians don't? I guess, how do we get to this place? We're arguing about women, y'all. How did we get here?
Yeah.
I think it was slow, and there were enough people who didn't speak up or didn't think that it was going to end up to where it is. And the people who did say that, everyone was like, that's crazy. That's never going to happen. In particular with same-sex marriage and the LGBT community, no one, I mean, there was always the T, but at the time, I feel like it was out of people's immediate reality. Like they maybe didn't know anyone who was transgender. The gender pronoun thing wasn't really in the forefront of their life. So they could kind of just ignorance is bliss kind of thing.
Is that synonymous with transsexual, transgender?
I believe they're used synonymously now, but there's a lot of like technical terminology that people choose to use and choose not to use. I know that
I have no idea.
Like people who were transgender maybe 20 years ago, they used the term transsexual because they knew that they could change they would say that they could change their sex, but not their gender. I mean, obviously, as Christians, we believe them to be one and the same. They're synonymous. They could be used interchangeably. There's no distinction between sex and gender, but that's one of the arguments around gender ideology in it of itself, that it's a social construct, that there's no way you can determine someone's gender without them telling you, and that it can be whatever they want. That's the whole premise. So that's why they are to be separated. And that's been something that's been in the vocabulary and research for many, many years. It just didn't really come to, I would say, culture until much later, unless you were within those circles. So this is not a new concept necessarily, but it's so mainstream now that a lot of people are hearing about it for the first time.
I mean, this is just something, just always the questions, because you mentioned how very subtly this bait and switch happens. It's like abracadabra now in this conversation where we're only concerned about facts and logic and science. Wow. Let's only care about feelings now.
Yeah.
And I remember when, we did a seminar, and in that seminar we were talking about homosexuality, and all I wanted to do was show people how their feelings have been specifically manufactured to be a certain way, that there's actually this homosexual manifesto that went down. There are these Harvard professors that came up with a scheme about how to actually normalize homosexuality in America, and these different processes by which we would then normalize it, and desensitization, jamming, and conversion, and all these things that were right before our eyes. Reality TV shows, and every reality TV show has to have one gay person to be desensitized to it. You gotta jam what a Christian is with kind of conflating them with this Nazi by giving them movies where they see Christians are the ones who are the hateful ones and yelling F-bombs towards gay people and stuff like that. And then you gotta start converting. And like, this has been a long journey, and I just wanted to share the facts of it. I wasn't going to dive deep and be like, see, y'all, they've been tricking y'all all along, man. Wake up, man. I wasn't doing it. I'm in Silver Spring. I know where I am. All I wanted to do was say, hey, there are real people who wrote real papers, and they had a real process to make you think the way you think right now. And even me presenting that left people, kind of the people I was on the team with, like,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, man. I'm like, what do you mean? I don't know. I'm just reading. This is already, I didn't even write this. I'm just reading it. And I remember in New Mexico, you were sharing about what it means to try and do science now, especially in the context of this transgender stuff. I mean, what does that look like? How can you do science, or do you just get down or lay down?
So it's interesting because it kind of depends on where you're at, like what academic institution that you're at. I'm not at an academic institution. I'm not actively publishing any research right now, but I did read a paper today that was so confusing because instead of just saying male or female, it was like cisgender this and cisgender. It was just
words made up.
I had to read it like 6 times because it was so confusing, and it was just published last year. So I know that was probably a requirement for publishing, was looking at that, but the purpose of the test was to look at it was like a physical activity battery for females. And so all that to say, it makes it very confusing. So a lot of what will happen is people are enrolled in a study based on biological sex, and they will have to self-identify, and they would then also have to identify their gender. And then if it's different or does not match their biological sex, that would probably be stratified, or those individuals would be excluded from the analysis if it's you're looking at something that's gender based. So for physical activity research, a lot of times it is gender based because there are a lot of physiological differences between men and women, and there are also a lot of social differences between men and women when it comes to physical activity, the types of activity that they do, what their interests are, what they've been socialized to participate in. All of those things matter. And it becomes very confusing when you don't know. So I had that experience during my PhD. I had a student who was in 2nd or 3rd grade, and to me, she just looked like a little girl. But I had got an email from her parent saying, or his parent, it was a boy who was identifying as a girl. And so I didn't know that because as a kid, kids can easily kind of look like the other gender with some outfits and a haircut. Like this is not quite the same. And so I didn't think twice about it. And then after I found that out, I had to then, I just excluded them from the study because I was like, I don't know what to do with this. This is too complicated. So I ended up not including them. But we're going to see that more and more. And we don't have, the problem is with any kind of study or with data is you need a certain amount of data to be able to use the findings and have meaningful interpretation of them. So if you only have a couple people out of thousands who identify in this really specific way, the conclusions that you're able to draw from that are going to be limited because it's a really small sample size. And so until we have more better, high quality data, there are going to be more questions than answers. And that's going to be for decades, just because we've never seen the amount of kids transitioning, socially transitioning, or transitioning using things like puberty blockers as we have right now. And so to see the effects of that is going to take a long time. We're already seeing some of that, but just imagine how much more is going to be coming to light in 5, 10, 20 years. You know what I mean? Breaks my heart, honestly, but I don't think the evidence is going to be in favor of the current narrative.
No.
I just don't know if it's going to be put out there. That's my concern.
One of the biggest issues in science right now is not listening to the dissenting opinion. Like, that's important. It's like this majority rules. That's not science. You can't ignore the 3% of scientists that say, let's look at this again. Like, you can't ignore them. There's only 3% of them. And 97% of the corrupt scientists.
Yeah.
I mean,
and until very recently, that's a disagreement in science is expected and common and healthy.
Yeah.
That's what peer review is.
Right. Absolutely.
Yes. Yes. But now you're seeing that when things are getting peer reviewed, if you don't change it to fit a specific narrative, your paper won't get published. And so that happened to a guy. What was his name? Hold on, I have it right here. His name was Michael Bailey. He's at Northeastern, I believe.
Okay.
He was one of the professors who published some work around this area of transgender ideology. And he just said, like, I think he had to retract his paper, or they took it down or something. And
Wow.
he basically wrote a piece saying, like, he's just going to publish it in other forms. Like, scientists are just going to not publish peer-reviewed research. However, we're in a culture that's like only peer review or bust. Like, so if we can't get peer-reviewed articles that say this, there is going to be a portion of the population who is like, well, we don't have any peer-reviewed articles to say that, so it must not be true. And it's like, well, we don't have any peer-reviewed articles because they won't publish the ones that have findings that are inconsistent. So it's very murky. And
I mean, that
it's
was
not
before
good.
you brought him up. I was about to ask: is there any oh man, gosh, my brain, it's not working the way it used to years ago. Is there any just pure observation and in conclusions being drawn from observation in this form of science at all? Because it seems like Michael Bailey was doing that and he's not allowed.
Yeah. Well, there have been studies on transgenderism, and it's been called, gender dysphoria and things like that. There are a lot of good books I could recommend too that kind of outline the findings that have been laid out. But there are a couple people that have been kind of key figures. So Abigail Schreier's book, Irreversible Damage. So a lot of her book references the research of Lisa Littman, and who was a researcher who, she was at Brown University, kind of same thing. She kind of stumbled across these findings that were inconsistent with what she would have expected or hypothesized when she was doing her research. And so she did some more follow-up studies to look at this spread of transgenderism, specifically among adolescent girls. And what she found was that there was this aspect to it that was what we call a social contagion, that it was heavily influenced by social and peer groups at alarming rates, that these girls specifically were identifying as transgender, whereas in the past, transgenderism has primarily been seen in men who identify as women. But we're seeing this surgence of girls who are identifying as boys. And so
I'm sorry, don't lose your train of thought, because you sound like you were getting your groove there, but
that's wild.
There's something there, right? Because
we mentioned something like that.
We did. Now, you correct me if I'm wrong, but were there also studies? As a matter of fact, I think I might even have it up. I forget what it's called, but this link in the past years of it being mostly men who identify as women, wasn't that attached to some form of sexual arousal or attached to a paraphilic identity?
Yeah, sometimes. So for some people, they're aroused or turned on by dressing up as a woman or identifying as a woman. That makes them excited, and that is called something. I'm drawing a blank on what it's called right now.
A whole list of paraphilias up right now. You keep going. Autogynephilia.
Yeah, autogynephilia. Yes. So
sexual arousal of a man by his own perception of himself as a woman or dressed as a woman.
Mm-hmm. And this also has roots back to some of this. Now, I'm not saying that everyone who suffers with gender dysphoria is this way, but pornography is a huge part of this as well.
Ooh.
So that is often tied to some of these fantasies or sexualized fantasies of specifically men identifying as little girls, and that sort of dynamic, which is really awful and disgusting to think about, but that is part of it as well.
This is it is this type of thing. What we talk about on this podcast is one big frustration of ours is that we just don't have eyes to see the world's need for a savior. And so while these things can exist, while pornography, what is it called? What's the thing? The most popular porn site?
Pornhub.
Pornhub. Yeah,
OnlyFans?
Pornhub.
Oh.
Where I just read today that there's plenty of access to child rape via
Yep.
porn.
Yep.
These things are happening on a daily basis, and the links to these very degenerate things are in our everyday life. So a link to child rape on Pornhub could be just sexual promiscuity of any sort on through a TV screen, and that link can be linked to a Hardee's commercial where a girl is half naked eating a burger. You know, you had me at burger, you don't need her. But those links exist in our everyday life. Meanwhile, as Christians, we're so worried about being nice. Oh man, it's killing me. That's killing me. It's like, yeah, I trust. I want to trust that the Holy Spirit will yoke me up if I ever find it in myself to want to yoke another human up. And I also trust that I have brothers and sisters around me who would yoke me up if I start coming off as somebody who doesn't love the person I'm talking to. But until all of that stuff happens, let me spin, man. You know, they need to get these facts out here.
Yeah.
The world needs the truth. The world needs what you're talking about, and people trying to slow you down or any other believer down for trying to get this information out really irks me.
Yeah. And honestly, for a lot of people, they just don't know a lot of this. Like they do just need to hear it. And sometimes it does come better in a form of like listening to a podcast like this where they don't have to engage in the conversation directly because it is so heated that they can just kind of listen and take it in and think without having to immediately have a response. So we just need to keep talking about it.
Yeah. I remember you talking about you had a lot of different insights on the things that are happening in sports, in women's sports. What are some insights that people, if you could give people some information on things they need to be aware of that's attached to this transgender ideology and its pervasiveness in society today regarding sports, what would you say? What are some things you'd bring up?
I would say I think one of the ways that this is trying to be pushed through is by doing it with kids, because during childhood and adolescence there are less gender differences, and they kind of, I mean, obviously sex is determined at conception, but biologically little kids are pretty similar until they reach puberty. And so what's happening is they're trying to get rid of any sort of delineation between boys and girls, which happens to some extent already, like soccer teams when kids are like toddlers or whatever.
Right.
But what you're seeing now is once they start getting older in these sports circles, that there needs to be no sort of separation between boys and girls in not only where the sport is taking place, which can be dangerous because, I mean, you were both 15-year-old boys at one point. Like, testosterone's roaring. You're going through so many pubertal changes. Girls are like, there's different puberty happening for boys and girls. And we're basically just denying that or acting like it doesn't matter. And that's not true either. It's a safety issue. It's also a time when people are already uncomfortable with their bodies. So the social contagion that's happening with girls, a lot of it lines up with puberty because you're developing in a way that you're not totally comfortable with your body and you're questioning that whether you fit in or not. You're transitioning into this new stage of life. And now, instead of it being an awkward phase, they're told, well, maybe it's your gender that needs changed. Like maybe you're actually non-binary, or maybe you're actually a boy. And
aside from the changes, are there any other factors that go into the fact that little girls seem to be more susceptible to this?
Social media is a big one, a big factor with this. In fact, the social contagion and the work of Lisa Littman and Abigail Shire's book talks a lot about how social media has an impact on this. you think about social media apps and just the access that kids have to these ideas that maybe they never were even exposed to before, that now they're taking in at a rate that's just like insane. And so things that they never questioned before are coming right to their face, and they're like, oh, well, I never really thought about this, but maybe that's true. And you have these TikTok stars who are showing their double mastectomy scars and saying like, see, like, I'm so happy, like this, that got rid of my anxiety and depression, or this, whatever. And it for a child who's maybe really struggling, that can seem appealing because they're placed in, I mean, I'm speaking about children who suffer with transgender ideology and stuff as maybe not Christians, but even people who, like, kids who are Christians can struggle with this, because it's essentially, like you were talking about earlier, is placing your identity in this other thing instead of having a solid, foundation, your identity in Christ, and being grounded in that. It's finding it in these other things, looking for comfort in these other places. And it seems really good. It seems like maybe it'll fulfill you for, instead of this other stuff that you're dealing with. But at the end of the day, I do think a lot of, well, I not even think, a lot of the research is showing that even after people go through the steps to start transitioning, that the outcomes aren't necessarily better. It's not like their depression and anxiety just goes away. It's not like their risk of suicide just goes away. It often doesn't, or gets worse. And that's really sad. And no one really wants to face that reality. We just want to focus on the people who are happy. But
this has to endanger even jobs like yours, right? At some point, they're not going to be interested in any findings you have, right?
Yeah.
Thanks for reminding me.
I'm just saying.
Yeah.
Look, I preach, so they'll probably get to me before you. But but I mean, it's like at some point, you will have to be playing doctor. Go ahead.
You were just saying, what's the last thing you said? I preach.
Yeah.
So to come to me first. Yeah, and so that's another issue, especially with young children in their developmental stages. I mean, you put an instrument in front of a child's hands and you can become very proficient.
Mm-hmm.
So anything else you thrust upon them, like you're talking about, adults get tripped up on this.
Yeah.
Social media addictions, TikTok. You got, I think it's a combination of irresponsible parenting. You know what I mean? Putting a computer in front of your kids' hands and letting them do whatever they want with it on TikTok, on Facebook, Instagram, along with the climate of Christians are bad and homosexuality and LGBTQ is on the right side of history.
Right.
And
that's also everything is actually falling under the umbrella of LGBT.
Yeah, everything.
I mean, so
everything.
It was the skin color, right? I remember that was a thing in America where even Black Americans were like, hey, man, you co-opting the struggle, blah, blah, blah. But now, it's all kumbaya. Everybody, everybody, we all vote the same way. So, we're all good and the same. But now you have disabled people who are part of LGBT.
I know. And then you have allies. So they're a part of it.
And so, but it's transgenderism is, kind of subtly combating all of the other letters. Does it not?
Well, it's oppositional to something that is binary, like what used to be called being like bisexuality. Like, it's basically, it's trying to say that you can be any gender, and that also that there are no genders, like, in the same thing. It's very conflicting, which is what you'll notice with a lot of the arguments for this stuff, is that they don't use logic or evidence. A lot of their statements conflict with one another. And whenever you question that, it's, well, you're just a bigot. You're just transphobic. Instead of actually thinking through why this logically doesn't make any sense. That's one of the biggest struggles with actually getting anywhere in a conversation about this, is because if you present an alternative, or even just like you were saying earlier, asking questions that are valid, they aren't welcome. And we're seeing this play out in several different areas in our culture, not just the transgender ideology, but it's essentially And for me as a scientist, like, it's been very much like you have to think this way if you are a scientist. It was the same with COVID.
Yeah, that's
And I fell for it. I fell for it with the COVID stuff at the beginning, even though I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm like, well, yeah, I'm a very logical, rational person. Like, I don't want to be outcast from my profession by going against any of this stuff. And I've changed my mind about that since all this first came out. But that's what it is, like this attack on identity. And when people don't have God, they put their identity in all sorts of things. And that's all this is really at the end of the day, is they see it as an attack on them because they believe that their gender dysphoria or their sexuality is who they are. It's not something they do. It's something that is part of them. And it's difficult because we know why they feel that way. And I think just speaking life into people like that, and even people who agree with it, because if you're a believer and you know what the gospel is and how powerful that is to transform someone's life, then you know deep down this is not right.
Right. You have a responsibility.
Yes. People need it. And people are going to be coming to the church when they are battered and broken after all of this, and it leaves them empty. And we need to be ready to welcome them and to share the truth with them, but to be ready to help them.
What would you say has been the most effective aspect of this argument? Like, if there are people listening to this episode and they're like, man, I really want to move towards this transgender person or share this thing with somebody who's very gung-ho in transgender ideology with their kids, what aspect of this argument do you think is the most effective for them to focus on and present to their neighbor?
I think it depends differently on if it is someone who is struggling with it themselves versus someone who is just supporting it. I think for someone who wants to support it or is like all gung ho with the ideology, that honestly just presenting the facts. So asking questions like, are you familiar with where transgender ideology came from, or the studies that originally tested looking at sexuality and things like that? And just ask. Most people will say no. Most people have no idea. They don't know that they were, trying to give babies orgasms.
Yeah, bro. Alfred Kinsey, right?
It's disgusting. Yeah, it's disgusting. Most people don't know that. And when they hear it, they're like,
statue of him at Indiana.
Yeah. Yep. The father of the sexual revolution, so feminists are really into that. So they want to tear down gender roles while simultaneously fighting for feminine. It just makes no sense. So I would just ask questions like that and ask, like, are you familiar with, any of the research that's been done on gender dysphoria? Like, did you know that if you just don't transition socially or physically transition, a lot of kids will just grow out of their feelings of gender dysphoria?
Yeah. Oh.
Did you know that social transition is not harmless? Because many adolescents especially report being so scared to detransition because of fear of what their friends and family would say.
And all of that, Brittany, sounds good. But there are parents who don't want their children to grow up normally.
Oh, yeah.
Like, they have their own issues and they're projecting them on their children. So you ask those questions, hey, do you know that it's not harmless? They don't care. They want their child to struggle with them.
Yes.
I mean, like, it's sick.
You know what's interesting though is I don't know how you guys feel. I feel like a lot of times it's the mom though.
Yeah. My question is, where is the father?
Yeah.
Where
I think about that a lot.
That's it.
Yeah.
By holding the camera?
Yeah, right. Yeah,
real talk. Right.
Real talk.
Right.
Well, I mean, we've seen that, right? We've seen where the father is or what happens to the father when he's present. What is that in Canada? right?
Yeah, they have a law where.
Well, no, I don't know about the law, but I'm just saying there's
Oh.
a father specifically
Oh
going
yeah,
through
who's
the battle. It's a divorced
yeah,
family,
Mm-hmm.
and the
yeah,
mother wants to transition a son, and the father
Doesn't.
is
isn't
fighting
on
it.
board.
You know,
Yeah,
he was getting cut out of the picture. You know, it's obviously
Mhm.
going in the mom's favor.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
man. But I
yeah.
think that there were some
It's
victories coming for him too. But
I hope so, but we're
me
gonna
too.
keep seeing that. So I think, you know, we all need to be having these conversations,
Yeah.
men and women. And gosh, it breaks my heart. But the more that people shy away from this topic and get too scared to say anything or talk about it, and for some people, like, they may feel like there's nothing I can do. And that's not true. One, you can always pray.
Amen.
Also, when it comes to things like this stuff being taught in school, you can stand up and say, no,
Yeah.
my child, no, and push back against it. It doesn't have to be some big thing that goes social media viral. A lot of this stuff happens in conversations behind closed doors. I think people see things like that online and think that if they don't do that, they're not doing anything. And that's also not true. Um, we all of us have a part to play. All of us have something that we need to be doing to fight this, because if we don't, it's going to get so much worse. And it's our job as Christians especially to stand on God's truth and stand firm in this absolute chaos, because there's such an attack on truth right now.
Yeah.
To say no, like, we know what the truth is. This is a very from like an apologetic standpoint, from a biblical theology standpoint, it's a very simple argument.
Yeah.
It's not like, do you know what I mean? It's not
Yeah.
God created the male and female. Like, there's
Amen.
nothing. That's it. You
Yeah.
don't really need much more than that.
Yeah.
And so I think coming at it from a perspective of not necessarily a biblical defense, because I think that's pretty clear. It's more this logic and asking questions, and do they know that because people are obsessed with science. If you can talk about science, they're like, well, is there science on that? And I'm like,
Right.
actually, you don't have to be a scientist to do
We were
that.
we were with him in New Mexico. He always says, "Science never uttered a word. Scientists do."
Right. Right.
Scientists are the ones saying things. Science has never spoken,
Right.
and that's
Yeah.
important. You mentioned a couple of resources. If you wanted to reiterate some resources for folks.
Yeah. So I'm a reader, so I'll recommend books first. Frank Turk's book, actually, Correct Not Politically Correct, the new edition of that has transgenderism in it as well. Abigail Schreier's book, Irreversible Damage. She talks about the work of Lisa Littman that I referenced a few times, and just tells some stories of families who are going through this. And then Miriam Grossman's book called Lost in Trans Nation. She was featured on Matt Walsh's documentary, What is a Woman? She was the child psychologist who has been very vocal about speaking out against this. She wrote a book as well.
Okay.
And all three of those are excellent resources. If you want to just read more about this, get some, it's not a scientific read, and but it will give you the science of it and have you very easily get some like statistics, talking points, stuff like that. Highly recommend that. And then, gosh, I think there's been a couple of podcast episodes that Frank has done on this, on his YouTube, on the Cross Examined YouTube. If you just search that, there's probably some good episodes talking to some different people about this topic as well.
Okay. And where can people find you?
You can find me at Brittany.LaBuff on Instagram. I also have a podcast of my own called Heaven and Health. Yeah.
Okay. Heaven and Health and Brittany. Was it Doctor or Brittany.LaBuff?
Brittany.LaBuff.
Brittany.LaBuff on Instagram. Guys, also lift up a prayer for her in her job, which, as a Christian, the nature of your job is to do exactly the opposite of what's expected of you. That's tough. So we lift up prayers for you and strength.
I appreciate it.
And I'll just reiterate one last thing you mentioned about people thinking they are what they do. Our identity is based on what we do. And the gospel essentially says this: we do what we are. We do sin because we are sinners, and therefore we deserve God's wrath, his justice. That's why we want justice, because he's just. But then it's because of what Christ did that transforms who we are. We become children of God through what Christ has done, to the point now when you listen to this podcast, when it comes to your parenting, when it comes to the way you view yourself, your sexuality, any of those things, if you trust Christ, then you can still go to the Father with confidence, because the things you do aren't in line with your identity. Your identity is a child, and that doesn't change. And you can trust the Lord to continue to shed the dead parts of you off that you're doing within line up with who you are. And if you don't trust Christ, you can trust him. He's offered himself for you. Trust him, and your identity will transform immediately. And in your life will continue to catch up to that identity that never changes in Christ. So, Brittany, thank you for joining us here on Black and Blurred. You've kicked off our busy fall. Congratulations.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.